You used my daughter for revenge, attained. Now, Emmy, now confess in chess.
Say my name again. His voice was a whisper, but it echoed in my head like a gunshot. The door to the hotel suite in Midtown was ajar, a crack into my personal hell, and I heard her response. Noah. No. Ugh. My wife's voice trembled like glass about to shatter. His cologne, the same one I'd bought him last Christmas, a gift from a subordinate to his CEO, burned my nostrils. And there, in the dimly lit hallway, all of New York City seemed to hold its breath with me. My name is Noah Mercer, and that night I discovered that humiliation has a sound too. It was the sound of sheets rustling, the guilty whisper, and the muffled laugh of someone who thinks they're untouchable. I'd worked 8 years at Harper Global, Richard Harper's corporate jewel. I believed loyalty armored the heart. But a heart isn't a vault, it's an art exhibit in a glass case, and they shattered mine right in front of the Times Square lights. The cold doorknob stuck to my sweaty hand. Instinct screamed to burst in, to turn that pain into noise, into violence. But violence doesn't pay dividends. Stepping back hurts, but it buys time to calculate, and I've always calculated better than I loved. I closed the hallway door with surgical care and let my marriage die without witnesses. In the elevator, descending like a coffin into a corporate grave, the mirror reflected back an executive without a badge, a man without direction. You knew, I said to my reflection, and it wasn't a question. Deep down, the signs were everywhere. The late meetings, the conspiratorial smiles, the growing distance between us. I just pretended they were normal market distractions. Down below, Manhattan boiled. The neon gave me colors I didn't feel inside. Madison, my wife, had a talent for hiding secrets and smiles. Richard Harper, my boss, had a talent for confusing power with entitlement. Together, they created the perfect equation for my collapse. But every collapse has an inflection point. Mine came on the descent to the subway on Fifth Avenue. I pulled out my phone, opened the calendar, and set a reminder for 6 months ahead. Just one word: re-entry. I didn't have a plan, but now I had a deadline. The silence after the fall is a cruel consultant. It cuts your costs, your ego, and your illusions. I sold the car, returned to the Manhattan apartment, and traded the designer wardrobe for pieces that don't draw attention. I went back to Queens, where the sound of the train reminded me that the city doesn't stop for anyone. So I didn't stop either. I created a spreadsheet called Resurrection. Tab 1, Forgotten Contacts. Tab 2, Liquid Assets. Tab 3, Targets in Distress. I didn't have capital, but I had memory, method, and a high-octane kind of resentment. Resentment without method turns into a tragedy. Resentment with method turns into an investment thesis. From there, I would be my own private equity fund. I called Peter Lang, my old mentor, the man who taught me to read a balance sheet like poetry. He listened to my story in silence. He said, "Noah, sharks don't stop swimming. If you stop, you sink and become a headline no one reads twice." It was the first time I'd smiled in days. Peter gave me a corner in his Flatiron office. That's where Mercer & Co. was born. A consulting firm without a sign, without a website, without excuses. We sold intelligence to companies in crisis. And above all, I sold myself. 3 months later, a pitch changed the game. A Midwestern family holding had a forgotten asset, a B2B arm of the old economy with ugly numbers on display, but a hidden gem in the inventory. I structured the acquisition, and when the deal closed, the cash flow breathed. And so did I. With the money, I opened a discreet LLC in Delaware, Northbridge Holdings. It would be my vehicle for silent operations. My revenge needed darkness, not applause. Fate, however, has an ironic sense of humor. On a rainy night in Chicago, after a lecture on restructuring, a voice called out to me. "Hi, I'm Emily Harper," she said, extending her hand. It was his daughter, the heiress to the empire that destroyed me. I took her hand, and the world went strangely quiet. I recognized the risk, the symbolism, the opportunity, and something that didn't fit into any spreadsheet. "Pleasure, Noah Mercer," I replied, hiding a fire behind a neutral smile.
The game, I decided right then, had truly begun. And this time, I would choose the rules. The post-lecture dinner was a study in contrasts. Emily Harper spoke with the clarity of someone who hadn't inherited the position, but the talent. I observed, measuring every gesture, every laugh, every chink in the Harper name. Revenge can start with a glance, and mine was already duly noted. In the following days, we exchanged messages about books and business. She worked on Harper Global's social projects. It was as if her father's DNA had been cleansed before reaching her. I saw no guilt in her eyes, and maybe that's why I saw danger. Loving the enemy is easy. The hard part is not getting lost in the process. I invited her for coffee, feigning casualness. We talked about the price of integrity. "Integrity is an illiquid asset," she said, laughing. "But it's the only one that doesn't depreciate when the market crashes," I replied. That night in my hotel, I created a new document, Harper Plan, Phase 1, Emotional Infiltration. The strategy was simple: gain trust, access information, identify vulnerabilities. But for the first time, I wrote something that wasn't part of the plan. Don't fall in love. Emily introduced me to her circle. I was the elegant outsider, the mysterious man with calm answers and a cold gaze. No one there knew my name was on Harper Global's blacklist. Meanwhile, I moved the pieces from under the board. I started buying small stakes in companies orbiting Richard Harper's empire. Each acquisition was an invisible spark, a crack in the castle he'd built. He didn't know it yet, but collapse starts like that, from within, in silence. Emily was the opposite of her father in everything that mattered, and every time I got closer to her, I felt the plan waver. I couldn't afford humanity while wearing the skin of revenge. But the heart, unlike stocks, doesn't respond to the logic of charts. One night in Boston, she held my hand. "You have the eyes of someone who's already lost everything, Noah, but also of someone who hasn't given up." The words hit me. I looked away, changed the subject. Emotions are data that can't leak to the market. When I got back to the hotel, I opened the Harper Plan document. Below "Don't fall in love," I added a new line. Too late. Revenge is a kind of insomnia, and I was only in the first stage. 3 months later, Emily took me to Harper Global's headquarters. The same building that once was my prison, now was my battlefield. The revolving doors still carried the cold smell of my failure. When the elevator opened, there he was, Richard Harper. Impeccable suit, lethal gaze. Well, well, the man I thought I'd never see inside my building again, he said, savoring each syllable. I held his gaze steady. "The market's small, Mr. Harper. Sometimes the dead come back to settle accounts." The room went silent. Emily laughed, thinking it was a joke. Only the two of us knew it was a declaration of war. During the meeting, he droned on with his venomous charisma, talking about sustainability and innovation. Pretty words to hide the accounting rot I already knew. I watched him, and my calm irritated him more than any insult. Later on the rooftop, we toasted to a supposed partnership. "My father likes you," Emily said. I smiled, measuring the irony. "He's always had a good nose for it," I replied. The real game began there, with her at the center of the board, innocent. Back in my apartment, the plan evolved. Phase 2, emotional and structural acquisition. used Northbridge Holdings to buy stakes in Harper Global's subsidiaries, becoming dispensable before becoming inevitable. Emily connected me to people who, unknowingly, would be part of the collapse. Every dinner, every conversation, every laugh was a thread I pulled. She believed we were building a future together. I was just rebuilding mine on the ruins of hers. At Richard's birthday dinner, he tested me. They say you have a talent for rising from the ashes. Fertile ashes, Mr. Harper. Some burn, others bloom.
He understood. His gaze shifted. It wasn't anger. It was forced respect. The acknowledgement that the subordinate he'd crushed had returned not as a rival, but as a successor. He launched an investigation into me. I left calculated trails, bait to waste his time and energy. The game was now psychological. And as headlines spoke of the mysterious investor challenging giants, Harper felt a shadow growing behind him. He didn't know it yet, but the empire was no longer his. Emily became the link between my past and my purpose. By her side, Harper Global seemed less like a corporation and more like a vulnerable organism. The love she felt was genuine. What I offered was strategic, but over time, I began to confuse cause and effect. The disguise stuck to my skin. Revenge became home, and hatred shelter. The cracks in the Harper empire started subtle. Poorly signed contracts, delayed suppliers, small investments I'd suggested months earlier began to lose money. Richard tried to hide the chaos, but I watched the collapse grow from within. The empire was bleeding, and he couldn't staunch the flow. Emily, worried, asked for my help. I hugged her, offering comfort, while thinking, it's working. Board meetings turned into arenas. Richard no longer inspired loyalty, just fear. And when I spoke, everyone listened. It was fascinating to watch power change hands without anyone noticing. In one of those meetings, I said the phrase that sealed my dominance. Maybe it's time to modernize the command, Mr. Harper. The silence was a requiem. He knew fighting me would be admitting weakness. And at Harper Global, weakness is a firing disguised as a transition. The wedding happened on a golden late afternoon in Central Park. Me, impeccable. The man Emily loved. Richard, with an acidic smile. The man who saw me as the beginning of his end. Every applause sounded like a hostile takeover clause. After the ceremony, he confronted me. You think I don't know what you're doing, Mercer? The difference is now you're playing with my name. Exactly, Mr. Harper. And that's why this time I can't lose. He backed off, tense. For the first time, I saw fear in that man. Not of me, but of his reflection in me. When the external audit confirmed the irregularities I'd helped create myself, the chaos was official. The press swarmed the building. Richard Harper disappeared for a week. When he returned, he was a broken man. The same kind of man he'd turned me into years ago. He entered the boardroom pale-faced, and I understood. The empire was mine, but the throne was empty, and the crown was made of ashes. I sat in the chairman's chair. The windows reflected Manhattan, cold and distant. The city seemed to applaud me, but the sound was mute. I felt more orphaned than powerful. I signed documents, led mergers, the predictable script of success. The newspapers called me a genius, but I only saw ghosts. With every contract, I bought more silence, and the silence, little by little, bought my soul.
One night, I returned to the penthouse where it all began. The whiskey glass reflected the city lights. I realized I'd inherited more than an empire. I'd inherited the emptiness of the man I destroyed. Success smells like expensive wood and ancient loneliness. I didn't defeat him, I just replaced him. I started investing in ethical projects, real innovation. The newspapers called it the Noah Mercer era. To me, it was just penance. I walked to work, watching the city wake up. Every face, a story I'd never understand. Maybe redemption is that, paying debts the world doesn't even know exist. At the opening of the new headquarters, the sign gleamed, Mercer Industries. It was no longer about Harper. It was about what was left of me after the storm. Power still belonged to me, but now it weighed less. The empire had been reborn, but with it, the regret I could never erase was born too. Narration. 2 years passed, 2 years of silence and reconstruction. It was at a charity event for education that I saw her again. Emily. She was stronger, more serene, with the same gaze that once dismantled me. When our eyes met, time seemed to hesitate between forgiveness and remembrance. She approached with a light smile, the kind of peace that can't be bought at art auctions. "Did you get what you wanted, Noah?" she asked, without a trace of accusation in her voice. I took a deep breath, the air heavy with unspoken words. "I think I'm still figuring out what I wanted," I replied. We talked like two strangers who once loved deeply. She told me about the new foundation she had created, focused on giving opportunities to youth from underprivileged communities. The exact opposite of the acquisition war that once united us. I listened to every word like someone hearing a confession, mine, not hers. When she mentioned her father, who lived reclusively in his country house, I realized there was no resentment in her voice, just history. "He was the villain in your life, I understand," she said, with a maturity that cut me. "But in the end, I think you learned from him not just to fight, but also to recognize the emptiness victory can leave." Painfully, she was right. Richard, in his fall, gave me the final lesson. Before leaving, she looked at me one last time, and her words were calm but definitive. "Revenge is just a sad way of continuing to love the past, Noah. I hope one day you can free yourself from it." I stood there with an untouched glass in my hand, watching her silhouette disappear among the guests. The hall was full of laughter and conversations. The world seemed at peace. But inside me, the war still whispered. And it was in that instant that the truth hit me with the force of a market crash. I'd won everything except myself. The final battle wasn't against Richard Harper. It was against the ghost of him that now lived inside me.
The next morning, I didn't go to the office. I drove for hours, aimlessly, until I reached a small coastal town. The sea crashed against the rocks with the fury and constancy of my own journey. There, looking at the horizon, I made a decision. It wasn't a business strategy. It was a surrender. I returned to New York and called an emergency board meeting. I announced my resignation as CEO of Mercer Industries. In its place, I proposed creating an independent committee to transform most of the company into a social investment fund, exactly like the one Emily had created. The goal would no longer be profit at any cost, but purpose. The remaining profits would go to her foundation. There was shock, disbelief, but for the first time, my words weren't calculated. They were true. I left the building that once symbolized my revenge, feeling a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The empire I'd built with so much hate would now serve to heal. Maybe that was the only acquisition that truly mattered. Months later, I received an email. It was from Emily. Just one line. "My father would say this was your smartest move. I say it was the most human. Thank you, Noah." Today, I'm no longer CEO. I travel the world, helping small businesses grow ethically. The name Noah Mercer is no longer on magazine covers, and I've never been so at peace. The story that began with the sound of a name being whispered in a hotel suite ends here, with the silence of a man who finally found his own worth. The empire wasn't the building, the money, or the power. The empire was the journey. And the final merger, the most important of all, was the one between the man I was and the man I needed to become. If you made it this far, it's because you understand that every great story, at its core, is about forgiveness, especially forgiveness of oneself.